It wasn't a police officer, but a firefighter at the time this happened. I was called by an alarm going off around 2 a.m. at what used to be a very old hotel late 1800s that had been converted into a fancy restaurant and upscale modern studio apartments. It was named after the original owner, but to avoid using the real name, I'll just call it Larry's. The alarm panel showed that the manual pull station on the 4th floor, the red alarm on the wall that you pull manually, had been activated. We didn't see anything from outside the building, but you never know. We silenced the building's alarm sound so we could communicate better and talk about how bad it was that nobody evacuated when we got there. Damn drunk hipsters, get off my lawn. We walked up to the 4th floor, found nothing typical prank in a college town, canceled the rest of the response, and reset the pull station. I should clarify that we means me and my first firefighter. I still had my driver and hydrant guy outside on the platform, went downstairs to reset the alarm panel, except the panel wouldn't reset. It still showed an active alarm on the 4th floor. In our sleep-deprived brains, we realized we hadn't fully reset the manual pull station, so we decided to take the elevator back up. We got in, used the firefighter key since the elevator was still locked due to the active alarm, and pressed the button for the 4th floor. The door opens, and we're in the basement. The basement is super creepy. It's sometimes used as a banquet wedding hall, and to prevent wear and tear on things when they're not in use. All the furniture is covered with sheets, and they keep the lights off down there. We looked at each other, and I scolded my firefighter for messing up and not hitting the number 4. We closed the doors, and I watched him press 4 this time. The elevator moves, and we arrive at the 7th floor. Once again, I think my firefighter screwed up, and I just want to get back to the station, so I tell him to meet me on the 4th floor, as he'll just walk down. I get to the 4th floor, and the stairwell door won't open. The doorknob turns, but the door won't move. I'm certain this door leads to the stairwell, but it won't budge. I radio my firefighter, telling him to quit messing around and let me in on the 4th floor, thinking he's somehow holding the door shut. He tells me he's actually not on the 4th floor, he's trapped in the basement. I ask him what he means, and he says someone pushed him out of the elevator door shut, and the basement stairwell door won't open. Now I'm a little pissed off. I've heard rumors about this place being haunted, but I never believed them, and I still think some college kids are playing a prank on us. So, I walk down to the basement and see my firefighter through the window on the door. The door won't move. Now I'm mad because this isn't funny anymore if it ever was. I raise my voice and yell, "Knock it off, Larry. We're tired of your crap and just want to reset the panel and go home." Suddenly, the door opens for us. My firefighter looks at me like, "WTF? Chief." We head back up to the 4th floor, and the door opens there too. The pull station is fine, so we go back down to the 1st floor and reset the alarm panel. It resets perfectly. The alarm panel room was in a closet in the restaurant area on the 1st floor, and there was also a bartender closing up for the night. Jokingly, I turn to my firefighter and say, "Guess it was just Larry having some fun, huh?" Suddenly, we hear a glass shatter. The bartender rushes over to us and says, "Don't make him mad. He can get angry and start breaking our glasses." He scares the hell out of me, and I hate nights when I have to close alone. I realize the bartender wasn't anywhere near the glass that broke, and this guy is dead serious, scared out of his mind. I just say, okay, sorry, Larry. Have a good night." The bartender looked relieved that I at least tried to be polite to Larry's ghost, and we went back to our station, one of the strangest calls I've ever responded to. I remember a story that my friend's father once told us. He was a police officer in Chicago and definitely had his fair share of crazy stories, but this one was strange, and he never got over it. This will be a long readjust a heads up. There was a senior living community where several houses were built in a large semicircle development. 4 or 5 of them were connected like townhouses. There was one particular house they could never keep occupied for long. At the time of these events, this house was vacant. The previous owners had suddenly gotten up and left without telling anyone. They left behind a lot of furniture and personal belongings. The electricity and phone lines had been disconnected. Well, there were a few incidents where a 911 call came in and was traced back to that house. My friend's father would arrive with his partner, check it out, and confirm that there was no power and no one inside. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary either, no signs of forced entry, and all the furniture was exactly in the same place. One night they received a call that was traced to that neighborhood, but this time it came from a neighbor, a woman we'll call Phyllis. When my friend's father arrived, Phyllis told him, scared, that she had heard someone stomping around next door and banging on the walls with what sounded like a sledgehammer. My friend's father and his partner cautiously checked it out. Once again, no signs of forced entry. When they went inside, nothing was disturbed or out of place. No furniture was overturned, and there were no marks on the wall where Phyllis had said the noise was coming from. There wasn't much more they could do, so they left. But the next night, Phyllis called again, saying she could hear footsteps again. Only this time, there were screams and the sound of things being thrown around. The officers showed up and checked the house. Once again, nothing was disturbed inside. All the furniture and everything they had seen the previous night were exactly in the same place. This time, they stationed an officer outside the house every night for 5 nights in a row. It was more for Phyllis than anything else. She was terrified. But during those nights, she didn't report hearing anything coming from next door. A few weeks later, they got another call from Phyllis saying she was hearing a huge commotion happening in the house next door. It sounded like 2 people screaming and arguing. My friend's father arrived and went to Phyllis' house to talk to her. He said she had pushed everything away from the right side wall, which connected to the house next door. All her furniture and belongings were moved to the other side of the room, to the left side, and she was sitting in her armchair, her knees tucked against her body, eyes wide as saucers. She was completely petrified. She sat there trembling and started telling my friend's father what had been happening over the past few weeks. She said she had heard screams, heavy footsteps, yelling, and what sounded like someone scraping a knife against the wall. There were loud bangs on the wall, the sound of furniture being dragged, and people laughing. She said she didn't want to call 911 again because she figured everyone thought she was crazy and making it all up. My friend's father admitted that, unfortunately, that's pretty much what he had thought. He and his partner sat with Phyllis and started talking to her calmly, trying to reassure her. They stayed for about an hour and were about to leave when they suddenly heard a scratching sound on the wall. It started off soft at first, and then got louder and louder until it sounded like someone was literally trying to claw their way through. Then the stomping began. It sounded like someone wearing combat boots was pacing back and forth inside the apartment. My friend's father and his partner bolted out of the house. They were going to catch whoever was behind this. No way in hell they were getting away this time. They stormed into the house, and to their dismay, they found no one inside. None of the furniture had been moved, and nothing had been touched again. My friend's father said he had never been so confused in his life. He knew what he had heard. His partner had heard it too. There was no denying it. But their eyes weren't matching what their ears had told them. He had no explanation. When they returned to Phyllis' house, she had a wry smile on her face. She didn't say anything about it, but he realized she finally felt vindicated. A few weeks later, my friend's father found out that Phyllis' son had come, packed her things, and moved her into his and his wife's home. He also heard that they finally sold the house next door. But the new owners moved out in the middle of the night, just a month later. That was the last time he ever heard anything about the place because he ended up moving here to Pennsylvania when he got custody of his kids. I always loved hearing his police stories, but this one in particular sent chills down my spine. Honestly, I couldn't sleep for a few days after hearing it. He was a pretty straightforward, no-nonsense kind of guy, so for him to tell a story like this meant a lot. I didn't receive many paranormal calls during my years as a police officer. However, one day, I was called in for the day shift because their supervisor was sick. We always had a unit watching the school zone in the morning and afternoon, since it was on a stretch of road where people frequently passed by. The weather was nice, so I went out and walked along the sidewalk. I enjoyed talking to the kids and giving them a chance to interact with the police in a positive way. A little girl approached me and asked why we weren't arresting the ghosts in the haunted house. Jokingly, I told her that was the Ghostbusters' job, but since they were in New York, I'd see what I could do. By then, a small group had gathered, and everyone was sharing stories about the same haunted house which was along a street adjacent to where we were. The complaints were typical knocking sounds, voices, screams, usually in the afternoon or evening when kids were walking home from school or playing in the area. I assumed it was just one of those playground legends that pop up out of nowhere, but there were so many of them who swore they had heard something. I decided to take a look. The house belonged to a family from Colorado at the time. I was working in a smaller town in Oklahoma. The mother had passed away years ago, and although the family still owned the house and paid taxes, they hadn't done anything with it. It was a decent-sized 2-story house for the area, but years of neglect had made it look pretty rough from the outside. My front desk staff took about a day to track down the owners. We called them, explained that we had received some noise complaints, and after an inspection, we noticed that the back entrance wasn't secure. They gave us permission to enter the residence and asked us to secure it if possible when we left. I worked the swing shift, usually from 8 p.m. to 4 a.m., so I stopped by that night around 10 p.m. I parked in front and approached the house, and sure enough, there were some muffled voices inside. I called it in and went inside. My other 2 units were tied up, and the noise was getting louder. I knew what I was hearing now and had a pretty good idea that this would be a quick in and out. Sure enough, I cleared the first floor and went up to the second, where I found some high school kids on a nasty-looking mattress. You can guess what they were doing. I told them to get dressed and meet me downstairs. I did a quick check of the remaining rooms and went back down. Turns out the house that the elementary school kids thought was haunted had actually become a love nest party spot for a group of high schoolers. The kids were of age, so I sent them on their way. I had to ask the owners if they wanted to press charges, but I was glad they didn't. The house was rotting and in terrible shape. Who knows which group of kids had broken the windows or kicked in the back door first. They ended up demolishing the house and selling the lot about a month later. I was able to track down the young girl who had first reported the haunted house a week or 2 later. I explained to her that the house wasn't haunted, that we had taken care of the noises and that she shouldn't hear them anymore. I told her she could always call us if the noise came back. We kept an eye on the place for about a month until the owners finally tore down the old house. I worked closely with a PMC who told me a story that has always stuck with me. He will recall his version from the last time he told this in a group chat we had. So my guy was working at a mansion in Lashhorst, a wealthy lakeside town in northern Germany, for a few weeks. It wasn't particularly exciting and consequently not a great paycheck, but after 3 trips to Iraq and 2 to Yemen, a nap fest in the beautiful German countryside didn't seem so bad. He and his team were staying in the east wing of the mansion, where all the waitstaff and their families also lived, while the guests who hired him and the mansion's owner were staying in the west wing. Because of this, they became friends with the service staff, and about 4 days into their stay, one of the maids came to my friend and some of his guys, worried because her children had heard voices and noises in the woods that afternoon. Now keep in mind, this is one of those properties with several acres. It had its own private lake, stables, the works. The kids were near the archery range when they got spooked, which was about a mile from the main complex. To make things even less credible, they had been out there smoking weed. That said, one of the kids swore he had also heard ghosts out there the day before, and he hadn't smoked anything that day. So my friend and his guys decided to gear up and check it out, thinking there was a small chance it could actually be a threat. But since this was my friend's first time as a team leader, he wanted to play it safe and be sure. He also thought it would be a nice early evening stroll, so he picked his favorite guys to go with him, while the rest of the team stayed at their posts. The 2 of them head out, and it ends up being a really lovely walk. They pass along a river. There's a cliff overlooking the lake, some real Bob Ross type scenery. The sun is starting to set when they finally approach the archery range. Out of habit, they split up and flank each side of the field as they approach, and when he reaches the far south end of the range, my friend hears the faint sound of shuffling feet and humming. He immediately goes on alert, signals along the path to show where he's hearing noises from, and the 2 regroup. At an outhouse, near the edge of the course, they both hear faint noises coming from inside, but it doesn't sound like someone taking a dump, doing drugs, or having sex in there. It almost sounds like some kind of creature or maybe a ghost, carefully rummaging around. It's too quiet to be a bear or a homeless person, but too loud to be a squirrel or a rabbit. They decide to try scaring it by shouting, hoping to get a better sense of its size and nature, knowing that if something comes out of that outhouse, it'll probably get shot immediately. My friend yells, "Hey!" And instead of hearing an animal scurrying away or growling in response, they hear shuffling and muffled voices from inside the outhouse. Then silence. At this point, the two of them are extremely confused, but after a few seconds, their training kicks in, and they recognize that if there is a person in there, ghost or not, they are a potential threat. They draw their weapons and take position at the outhouse. My friend shouts, warning whoever is inside that they have trespassed and that they have the authority to shoot on sight. He orders them to make their presence known. No response. They look at each other, unsure of what to do. He calls out again, this time repeating everything in German, and after a few seconds, a female voice calls back, "Nico schie, Nico schie, wir wollen einfach nur Spaß haben," which means, "Don't shoot, we're just trying to have some fun here." My friend has no idea what to think. After some back and forth communication, they find out there are two women inside, claiming they need help. He opens the outhouse door, weapons still drawn, and finds it empty. He swears to God that the first thought that crossed his mind was, "Holy shit, the kids were right, there are ghosts here." Well, he calls back to the voice, asking where they are, and from beneath the toilet seat a voice replies, "Higher, here," in German. His stomach immediately drops. This has gone from an unlikely threat to a lovely forest walk to a real problem deep inside an outhouse that they now have to deal with. Still half expecting it to be a ghost, he peers into the latrine and sees an image he swears will never leave him in the middle of the pool of liquid shit. There are two pairs of white eyes staring up at him. He starts to make out two figures down there, both covered in filth, and immediately throws up his lunch, and this is a guy who's seen some messed up shit during his service. And to make a long story short, it turns out that an eccentric lesbian couple who had been guests at a party hosted at the mansion a few weeks prior had snuck back onto the property to have some fun in the latrine. They had a rope ladder, flashlights, and even earplugs. Clearly, this wasn't their first time. And while they had technically been guests at the mansion, the owner claimed he didn't know them and wanted them arrested for trespassing. I say guests because, in the end, he didn't press charges when all was said and done. Apparently, this mansion was also known for hosting wild sex parties like Eyes Wide Shut type stuff, and my friend says some of the staff recognized the two women after they were cleaned up, of course, from working at some of those parties. Plus, there were rumors that the girls were in that outhouse with the knowledge, if not the explicit instruction, of the mansion's owner and possibly the current guests who had hired my friend in the first place. He decided not to pursue it further, as is normal in this line of work. But he has a few other crazy stories from that job that make me think there's a lot of weird shit rich people do just because they have the time and money for it.